Once upon a time. Welcome to Australian Book Lovers, your destination for imagination.
Australian Book Lovers acknowledges First Nations peoples and recognises their continuous connection to country, community and to culture. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and honour the sharing of traditional stories passed down through generations. We're committed to a safe and inclusive welcome for authors and readers of all cultures and backgrounds, including people of LGBTQIA+ communities and their families. Hello everybody and welcome to our very special Writers' Room. At ABL, our mission is not only about celebrating and sharing fabulous Australian and Indigenous authored books of all genres with readers around the globe, it's about finding fantastic resources and information for authors looking to write their own book or two or three. And what better resource than getting into this writer's room with some of those authors and asking them to share their experience. This is episode 161. I'm Veronica Strachan, aka V.E. Patton, author of fantasy memoir and some non-fiction bits and pieces that we won't share on this podcast, and some picture books. And I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri Wurrung Country.
And I'm Laurie Bell, also coming to you from Wurundjeri Wurrung Country, and I am the author of fantasy and science fiction for young adults, middle grade and adults, and lots of flash fiction and short stories in there as well. So it is a lovely writer's room that we have today, with a little bit of history, a little bit of mystery. Let's go for it.
Yeah. So we are rolling back the timeline with three, I'll say historical fiction writers in inverted commas, because there's so much more than that. We've got Duncan Graham, Vines and Paul Rushworth-Brown. Good evening, everybody.
Evening.
Good evening.
Lovely. And Anne's giving us a beautiful nod, so thank you, Anne. Let's start with you, Anne, because you came into the room first. So, whose country are you on tonight?
I'm in Wurundjeri Country in Melbourne, in Naarm today. That's beautiful. That's where I live.
Yeah, it is a beautiful spot. We won't say it's the best city in the world, but it's coming close. Paul, tell us, whose traditional country are you on tonight?
Traditional country is Gadigal of the Eora Nation.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Duncan, yourself?
I'm coming from Gadigal country in Sydney.
Excellent. Beautiful. All right. This is episode 161, believe it or not. It is, that is a lot of hours under our belt. We're going to start with a quick bio and talk to people about the book that's kind of the focus of the discussion, because I know a number of you have more than one book. But we're going to start with Duncan, because you were the first one that said, yes, I'll come on, which was lovely. All right.
Well, can I take that back? Yes.
Not at all.
No, because I quite like the twist in your bio. All right. Dr. Duncan E. Graham, SC, is a writer, a senior counsel at the New South Wales Bar and a medical doctor. From a young age, Duncan wanted to write, but like many before him, has struggled to find the time or the impetus outside of family and work commitments. His original plan was to do a Bachelor of Arts so he could fashion a career in writing. He was completely committed to that course until his wise history teacher advised him that studying medicine would lead to a great career, but that to pursue law meant an even greater one. Not knowing what to do, Duncan decided to do both. Now, after a medico-legal career, he's returned to what he wanted to do in the first place. Absolutely true, Duncan?
All true.
All true, yeah. And I'm having a little chuckle to myself, because when I said I wanted to do writing, they said, yeah, that's not a real job. Go and get a real job. So science degree and a nursing registration and a few other bits and pieces. Yes. All right. And now come back to writing. Blurb for When the Dust Settles, which, as you'll see, will be, Duncan is absolutely ideally situated to tell this story. Do you know what's within you? If it's deadly asbestos, you'd better have what it takes to fight for what's right. James and Jenny Henderson came to Australia for a new life. They started a family and worked hard for a brighter future. They never expected to be fighting for their lives or for justice in a court case against two of Australia's largest companies. Big End lawyer Bruce Fraser hopes to springboard into partnership and fame and a win for his client, a leading asbestos cement manufacturer. Plaintiff lawyer Viviana Glossioli must overcome her self-doubt, her boss's advances, and the sausage factory mentality of her firm if she's to secure a win for James and Jenny. What unfolds is the ugly truth of asbestos and the legal industry it spawned. James and Jenny's story embodies the history of asbestos exploitation in Australia. Their legal battle has the potential to change the law forever. Money, careers, reputations, lives, everything is at stake. Where will the dust settle after all is said and done?
There's a book.
There is a book.
Sounds very interesting, doesn't it?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And obviously, you've got some insider information, some great write what you know, medico-legal background. Is there, let's go, what inspired you to write this? Why this particular story?
Well, it starts with what I actually did after I changed careers from medicine to law.
Mm-hmm.
I found myself in the litigation department of a large law firm in Melbourne.
Mm-hmm.
It was a national firm. I
Yeah.
eventually was in the same firm in Sydney. And one of their clients was an asbestos cement manufacturer, James Hardy. And I spent many, many hours reading a lot of medical literature, documents, involved in litigation, talking to experts around the globe, and learning a lot about asbestos. And I've moved on to other things like class actions and medical negligence. Haven't really got away from medicine, which was the intention in the first place.
Uh-huh.
But that motivated me to tell a story about the people that I've come across over a number of years, about 10 years of doing this, and how asbestos has affected the lives of so many people, ordinary men and women, not just workers, but people with minimal exposure, and still continues to do so, rather than let the enormous amount of information that I obtained go to waste. That's what it seemed to me at the time. I had started another book, which I won't bore you with. It's still in the production line, but this seemed to be a better thing to do, or an easy thing to do, even though when I say easy, it proved to be exceedingly ambitious to do something that spanned decades of Australian history, which we will all talk about at some stage, I'm sure, about some aspects of historical fiction writing. And I was also interested in legal drama. So it is a combination of historical fiction and I'm going to call it medico-legal drama as a new genre.
Excellent.
And a little bit like crime, but it's medico-legal. So that's what it becomes in the end, which is the vehicle, as you've gone over, Veronica, for telling the history about asbestos exploitation and use in Australia.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love a little bit of medico-legal. Laurie, tell our listeners about Anne, please.
I will indeed. So, Anne Vines is a Melbourne-based fiction writer. Her novel, The Shipwife, was published in 2023. Her short stories have appeared in award-winning Australian Writing, 2015, Word You Up, 2014, Wassafairy Magazine Online, 2016, Ring of Words, 2018, and Boondara Literary Awards Anthology, 2020. And won the Burundara Award in 2014 and the Keith Carroll Award in 2020. All these awards. She was commended in the Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Unpublished Manuscript in 2008 and in the Varuna Harper Collins Award in 2007. She was also shortlisted for the Alan Marshall Award, the Age Short Story Award, and the International West Ferry New Writing Prize, and has worked on both her novels at the Varuna Writers Centre, and she's completed a Bachelor of Arts at the University of Melbourne in Literature and History. Jinx! And taught in secondary schools and adult education in Victoria and London, which led her to co-write the VCE English and Literature courses, and has lived in England and Germany and travelled in Europe, USA, South America and Asia. From childhood, Anne loved reading and hearing stories about Melbourne in earlier times. She was intrigued to find out about the city in the 1940s, the dancing, the music, the Yanks and the fear of Japanese invasion. Her aunt's talk of going out and her uncle's talk of fighting in the Pacific were exciting and mysterious. There was a gulf between men's and women's lives in wartime. The voices of Faye and Peter came into Anne's mind, and then she could see the two of them in Melbourne. And after writing a short story about them, she realised they had a lot to tell. The novel Flight is a story of what happened to them in 1942. So the blurb for Flight: American World War II pilot Peter can barely remember a time when he didn't need to fight. His life is still a flicker away from nightmare. He only feels at home in a fighter plane. When he comes to Melbourne, the girl he wants is Faye. But he's not in the race. He'll never be the marrying kind. Yet Faye is the first woman he's going to miss, more than his other friend, Tivoli dancer Iris. Faye finds herself engaged to Melbourne's most eligible man, but he never looks at her as if there is no one else in the world. Then Peter gives her just that look, and she must decide what she wants and learn how to fight for it. Snobs and moralists in Melbourne say that nice girls don't go out with Yanks. Faye and Iris face new choices and dangers in a time of change. Fantastic. I feel like we've got so much in common there, Anne, because I've taught in London as well and been a teacher.
I'm a teacher as well.
Hey,
Ah,
let's party. And what inspired you to write this story? 1940s, Yanks and Aussies?
Well, it is an era that I've always been rather fascinated by, the music, the films and stories of the 1940s and 30s. And as you said, I was a little inspired by my aunt's stories and my uncles and my parents. And when I was small, I was fascinated to hear the stories. But when I grew up somewhat, I realized there were a lot of stories I was not being told. And I suppose I became rather curious, what really did happen? What were things like? And so the area that I found myself drawn to was the private lives at the home front. When I first started writing the book, it was a much larger book, and I did include some battle scenes, but I found to my interest that, in fact, they weren't the things that were really unusual or were really breaking new ground to me. It seemed to me that there hadn't been very much written about women's lives in Melbourne in 1942 and in women's lives as they met Americans. And I was walking in Collins Street, Melbourne one day and passing the Regent Theatre, which some of you may know. It's a very ornate theatre with steps. And I imagined American soldiers there meeting women, which they would have done because it was a cinema then. And so that's where my short story sparked off, and the characters, particularly of the woman Faye at that point, came to me. The male character, Peter, arrived a little later and was really rather connected, strangely enough, with the Battle of Britain and the area in London where you can go to Duxford Airport and other places and you can actually see Spitfires being, well, you could a while ago, only 10 years ago, you could see real Spitfires being flown by current pilots, and they'd show you just what sort of thing people could do with those planes. And I knew that I wanted my person I was going to spend a lot of time writing about, the man, to be a fighter pilot and to have flown a Spitfire. And a few Americans, when I researched, I discovered there were a few Americans who did indeed do that. And of course, my character then comes to Australia where there isn't quite as much organisation, and it takes months for the Americans to even get planes there and get their their work started. So in a sense, he has a frustrating time hanging about in Melbourne, meeting women and others, and finding that Melbourne is perhaps a little bit different from where he's been in the past, but rather like London, but a lot smaller. And so he finds himself really discovering things about what he would really like in love and in the future.
Beautiful.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And the Spitfire, I'm not going to say that too loudly because my husband will come running in. Although I think he's gone to badminton already. He had a T-shirt on Sunday with a Spitfire that my daughter, he just loves them, and he would dearly love to have a flight in one. But yeah, we went up to Tokemore recently at the Tokemore Air Museum and had to look through all of that, and so it was hard to eke him out of that. A great era, and we did have another author, Anne, who talked about there was a serial killer around in Melbourne at the time. And, we find out lots of different things. And, of course, they were bivouacked in Royal Park, near the Royal Children's Hospital and all of those kind of things. And, yeah, different era completely.
Yes, I do, in fact, move to the story of the serial killer and incorporate that in the book. Yes, couldn't leave that out.
No.
It's terrible.
All right.
We went and killed.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. Our roles were changing then. Okay. Paul Rushworth-Brown is an award-nominated author whose evocative historical fiction bridges the landscapes of Yorkshire and the Australian outback, weaving tales of resilience, love and cultural healing. Born in England and a proud Australian for over 20 years, Paul brings a unique perspective to his writing, one shaped by his own journey of migration and the search for belonging in a new land. His novels, including Outback Odyssey, Dream of Courage and Red Winter Journey, draw readers into rich, immersive worlds where the past speaks through the landscape and where the quiet strength of the human spirit is revealed. Red Winter Journey was nominated for the prestigious Premier's Literary Award, and Paul's storytelling continues to resonate with readers who seek stories that go beyond adventure to explore deeper themes of reconciliation, cross-cultural understanding, and the redemptive power of truth-telling. His latest work, Outback Odyssey, exemplifies his blend of lyrical prose, meticulous historical detail, we'll get to some of that, and allegorical depth. The novel speaks to both the challenges of post-war migration and the broader national journey of healing and connection, echoing Paul's own experiences of adapting to a new land while carrying the echoes of another. When he's not writing, Paul finds inspiration in the quiet beauty of the outback and the wide horizons of the Australian bush. His novels are more than historical adventures. They're bridges between cultures and reminders that every place holds its own story if we're willing to listen. All right. The blurb for Outback Odyssey, which is Paul's latest and what is the one that's on Australian Book Lovers. Set against the red dust of 1950s Australia, Outback Odyssey is a sweeping historical novel of adventure, survival and reconciliation. When Jimmy, a post-war migrant from Yorkshire, arrives in Victoria's vast outback, he's searching for more than just a fresh start. He's searching for belonging. But the land is harsh, the silence deep, and survival requires more than muscle. Through a chance encounter with Jarrah, a wise First Nations elder, Jimmy discovers the ancient rhythms of country and the healing power of listening. As Jimmy's journey unfolds, he's drawn into a spiritual odyssey that echoes Australia's own struggle for truth-telling and justice. Love, friendship, and the redemptive power of country form the backbone of this lyrical story, where the outback itself is a living character. For readers of historical fiction and cultural tales, Outback Odyssey offers an unforgettable experience of hope, healing, and the quiet power of the Australian landscape.
Did I write that?
You did. Well, somebody did for you, Paul. I don't know whether it was the other delight. Who's it, Hayley, that I've been chatting with? Yes. Anyway, so why that period? And obviously there's a little bit of an echo in your own story, but why the 1950s? Because surely you're not that old, I'm going to say.
Well, the beginning of the novel is actually loosely based on my father's journey from Yorkshire to the outback.
Mm-hmm.
But getting back to your question, my other three novels are sort of like adventure, romance, historical fiction novels set in Yorkshire. Going back to 1590 and the English Civil War, the 1700s in Yorkshire. But my fourth one, I really wanted it to. Firstly, I wanted to write about Australiana, and secondly, I wanted it to really mean something. So the novel is actually allegorical. In other words, reading it at face value, it'd be sort of similar to the other ones, historical fiction, bit of romance, adventure. But after the 23 referendum, I had this idea that I wanted to write a novel that I suppose it really puts a mirror to Australians' faces, and it's allegorical. There's a lot of symbolism there, and I suppose the protagonist Jimmy is actually the way he is and the way he reacts to First Nations culture. He's sort of like the opposite of us. And I don't say everybody, but based on what happened in that 23 referendum, there's a lot of sort of allegorical meaning in there about how First Nations people have been silenced and why. So there's a lot of that. But as I say, there's two ways of reading it, sort of like adventure, romance, historical fiction, or if you dig deeper, you can see the actual meanings between the lines.
Thank you. It's incredible that we've got three, as I say, inverted commas, historical fiction authors, but so different. And historical fiction, of course, spans aeons and generations. And you've given us a little hint as to why this particular part of history fascinates you. So it requires a lot more research than other areas. And, I just want to say a little bit ask you about your research process, and then kind of how much do you decide to be faithful to history because you've written fiction, but all of you have got real time zones and real events and, real cases, Duncan, that are part of your story. So how much research do you do, and how much do you go, well, that's going in the book, that's not, and how much kind of embroidery do you do? Duncan, let's go with you.
Well, my position might be slightly different from historical fiction writing because it's based on all of the research I actually did.
Yes.
Professional, and it encompasses not only the legal cases that I did, the litigation, but also draws upon my medical knowledge. But largely it's the professional work that I did, reading literally 3,500 to 4,000 medical journal articles on asbestos medical issues, thousands upon thousands of discovered documents tendered in evidence, history of asbestos industry, legal cases over the decades, and interviewing people that were there on the ground, including from the 1940s, because my book covers the 1940s, which is when the asbestos mine was discovered in northwest Australia. Wittenoom, it's not called Wittenoom, but that's when Wittenoom was discovered and was exploited from 1946 to 1966. And the couple in question, the two protagonists, came out on Bring Out of Britain in the 1950s. And one of them starts in rural northwest Australia. So there seems to be some sort of similarities in relation to World War II, post-World War II, the 1950s and onwards into the 1990s.
Yeah.
But the process for me is it's all in my head, and it is that I have used, and then to make sure that the circumstances are accurate in terms of, let's say, household appliances or cars or whatever, that I use the internet to double check in terms of ensuring that medical discoveries were correct. I've accessed materials like textbooks, journal articles that I already have, and legal cases. And that's pretty much the process, which, as I say, I got paid to do that research. And that might be, I think, probably, and I should say, which I'm sure Anne will expand upon listening to her story, a large part of the characters are actually based upon family history as well, such as I'd be interested in how this affects historical fiction writers generally, but I have had regard to people that have come out to Australia as convicts, which some of my forebears have. They're actually used the same surname in the book. And also family history, for example, knowledge of Glasgow, as well as knowledge of Sussex in England, what towns were bombed during the Second World War, because both Jenny and James lost their parents to German Luftwaffe attacks, and the places that are in the book in England and Scotland are places I have travelled to and know because relatives have lived there. So that's another source that I have used. And the other part of your question, Veronica, was how faithful I have been to the history. Well, to put it shortly, I use the historical facts as the framework, and I'm sure this is a common way of doing it. The framework, actual events, actual medical journal discoveries, scientific discoveries, operation of mines, when they're closed down, when things were discovered about what was dangerous, what was done about it, actual cases. I use them faithful to what actually happened, and then the characters operate at large within that framework.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's a very common model for historical fiction and hard to balance though sometimes. And you've got some of that family history, as Duncan mentioned, drawing from people who've told you stories, and the framework, almost like there's the skeleton is there, and we clothe it all, put the muscles and movement on ourselves. What about yourself now? Research, facts, how much goes in, how much is embroidered?
Yes, I must say I didn't really use anything concrete from my own family history. And in fact, that had very little to do with my writing of the book. My research was much more into books of the era and going to places, going to war memorials in England and in Australia, reading a lot of recent research that has come out about fighting in the Pacific. In fact, even just as the book was going to print, I went to the War Memorial thinking sort of proudly, oh, well, I won't buy anything today. I finished the book, but there were 5 books that I really had to read, had to say to my publisher, here they are. I'm using them. So printed material was really important. I mean, things like Joan Beaumont's book and Kate Darian Smith's book, The Home Front, those books were really, really crucial for me. And also, so was film of the era. And I found particularly in the later stages of my research, because I wrote the book almost before I'd done detailed research. I wrote a draft and I knew the characters, and I wanted the characters to be as they were, and then going back and looking again at more research, I found there was a great deal more film available, even from just library links, YouTube links. I had written a scene about my characters, the woman Faye Beauregard and her rather well-off relatives. I had written a scene of them riding around the Tan in Melbourne, which is the track around the Botanic Gardens. These days, people run about it in singlets and shorts, run around. But in those days, people got on horses in beautiful knitwear and jodhpurs. And I actually saw that after I'd written it. I saw it in films from the archive. So footage to me was very important. But also, I should say, even though I didn't use family history, I did indeed have the good fortune to meet quite a lot of older women who had been through the war years and who had had extraordinary experiences, including with American soldiers. And one, in fact, had married an American soldier, gone over there, come back to Melbourne. And she was very much of the sort of background that I had imagined Faye to be in, very well-to-do, very established, and so on. And so meeting some of those people was really wonderful, and allowed me to not really include anything personal from them, but just to get verification of the sorts of places they met, what sorts of things they were concerned about during that 1942.
Fantastic. All right, Paul.
Yeah, look, the first thing you need to consider when writing about First Nations people is you obviously have to be very, very respectful, and you have to be very, very accurate. And also I needed to dive into a lot of anthropological texts to find out the deep, I suppose, tapestry of First Nations culture. Now, I don't speak for First Nations people, and the novel doesn't either, but what it does is it obviously that tapestry of First Nations people is actually an integral part of the story. The point of view of the novel is that of a migrant that comes to Australia from Yorkshire and comes over with a £10 POM scheme, and gets sent out to goes through all the living in the hostel and all that type of thing, and then they send him out to the Outback, and just doing that research for in those some of these anthropological texts date back to sort of like the late 1800s, and so that was really, really interesting. And the novel is getting quite popular over in the US, and that's because people don't know very much about First Nations culture and Australia. The research for me, not only with Outback Odyssey, but also with my other three novels, is for me, it's like stepping back in time myself. I love it.
I can tell that you all do. So
Yes.
if you say stepping back in time to Laurie and myself, we think you meant a time machine, and we've, checking Doctor Who and transporters there. Laurie, your turn
Absolutely.
for a question.
Well, speaking of, so using your historical research and all of the little snippets of history that you are focused on, how do you then bring those characters to life for modern readers to really make those historical figures feel so realistic and just so that we can understand them from our modern perspective? And do you want to jump in?
Oh, yes. Well, I think it's very much looking closely at their feelings, at least in my writings. My first novel, The Shipwife, was about a convict who had a pretty terrible time on a ship and some rather hard times in Sydney, in very, very early days of Sydney. And then the second novel, Flight, which is about 1942, that also looks at people who are really frightened, and at least some of them, and other people who feel they're being tested. They really must show their mettle. They must stick to what they've been taught and what they believe. I also looked at the backgrounds of the characters, and the male character, Peter, the American, I wanted somehow, it wasn't so much that I wanted, but he sort of appeared somehow in my mind as someone who was very much from an underprivileged and quite unprotected background. And what would have happened to a boy like that in growing up from 1920 be in America. And one can imagine, the poverty, the exploitation of children, a child without family protection, what's going to happen? So I was very interested in looking at his trajectory and how would he overcome those kinds of traumas and losses and abuses of the past. And so I think those are very much emotions that people today are grappling with. We've just recently, in the last little while, been looking at the whole question of children, unprotected children, and how adults can be exploitative. And so that's one area. And also we've very much been looking at the position of women and consent and love politics, and that's very much also what I was interested in looking at in that time of great flux, when people were meeting strangers, when there was a great deal of fear and uncertainty. It's easy for us looking back, but at the time, people really were put into almost panic situation. And it's interesting what kinds of emotions people come into, but I think it's really similar to people of any time and very much what we're still exploring today. So if you go close enough, if you really go into the heart and the minds of the main characters, as I'm sure Duncan and Paul do and would agree, if you go close enough into the heart and mind and show the context, and I tried to show a range of different characters from different backgrounds and levels of security. And I think that's really interesting too, because it asks the reader then for some compassion and understanding and to think about the questions it raises.
Mm.
Well, Duncan, so because you had specific stories, how did you back away from those specific stories in bringing them your characters to be really authentic and feel really emotionally connective to readers, but not actually give someone's real story?
So, so the actual story and elements of the being exposed to asbestos and then getting diagnosed with mesothelioma, a terminal condition, and going through that process and having witnessed families and, in fact, those who have suffered cancer, mesothelioma, it's really drawn from a whole lot of experience, both, I mean, I've cross-examined, at least a couple of hundred dying people or led them having evidence, but I've also treated dying people as in hospitals. So I drew on that. But in terms of, I mean, there's a number of aspects of it. One is obviously when it's historical, you've got to get the historical context, the environment or circumstances in which the character is operating to be as authentic as possible. And they've got to speak and behave not only consistent with their background, their own personal background, which will be interesting for Paul to expand upon in terms of Aboriginal people. So it's got to be consistent with either the gender or their background, where they come from, cultural, but it also has to be consistent with the time. So you don't have people using expressions that are absolute clangers in relation to the period. But also, and one of the things that I think is really hard, particularly if you have an ambitious setting of going through the decades rather than fixing on one point in history, that the voice, for example, of women over the years has changed drastically. And to actually portray Jenny as somebody who's lost her parents and come out to Australia and was going to marry a doctor in Perth, and that fell through because she fell in love with James, who's Scottish. Uh, she had been through a lot. She wasn't somebody, a woman in that era was, to a degree, takes a back seat, apparently, a back seat, or looks like a back seat, and has to find, ultimately in this story, her own strength. But you don't want to have a cardboard cutout type of character who's got nothing, but particularly writing about a woman in that era, particularly in the 50s and 60s, women today would probably think, oh, nobody's like that. And it's true, nobody is like that. But that's as far as I can work out, looking at my own family history, that is some element of being a little bit reticent to voice opinions, and that changes over time. So that's difficult. But in terms of the cases themselves, drawing on, it's just trying to put yourself in their position, in their context, speak a language that would be consistent with, for example, being diagnosed with a fatal condition, or describing a reaction of somebody when that person dies. And as I've seen it so many times and personally gone through it, that's what you bring to bear, life experiences. And as Anne has outlined, the human condition and how humans behave is fairly fundamental. Some of the circumstances might have changed, but if you can tap into the person being an authentic person in those circumstances and make the character live a life through your imagination in the circumstances, then hopefully it works in making the reader feel for that particular character, even if the character is good or bad or whatever it is. So that's the process, and hopefully it works.
Yeah. Well, Paul, you touched on it a little bit with your own, the fact that you've also undergone the journey of traveling to another country, but what did you bring to the book, just in making those characters feel so authentic?
Well, I spent a lot of time when I was young as working out in the Outback. I used to work for Queensland Railway, and as a navvy. So we used to basically it was sort of like a mobile camp, and it's sort of like trace the tracks through Outback Queensland. And what we do is we just replace the sleepers. And many years ago, I spent many months, I suppose, roughing it and living on the side of the road in the Outback. But so a lot of my research comes from those memories, and a lot of the characters come from a lot of the character of the characters comes from those memories as well. But the way I write, it's almost like there's a movie going on in front of my eyes, and all I do is just take that movie and put it down on a bit of paper or on the computer, and the rest is sort of like coloring in, like trying to paint a picture of what the Outback is like, trying to paint a picture of what it would be like to I remember sort of like one year I was out near Uluru, and this was way before it became sort of like a heavy touristed place. And back then, there was people climbing it and all that type of thing. But anyway, I actually I had a swag with me, and I slept sort of like at the base of Uluru. In the middle of the night, there was all these First Nations sort of like dancing. Obviously, there's a corroboree or something somewhere. There was dancing and singing and clapsticks going and all that type of thing. And because there was none of the hotels and things that you've got around there now, but the lights, the stars. There was no light. There was the stars, and they just seemed to sort of like they're almost like they're in front of your eyes. And so just things like that, I think. And coming across a billabong, in the middle of this very dry, parched area, and just things like that. I suppose not a lot of people have I suppose been able to treasure.
Yeah, right down to the smells of the dirt and the sun on your
Yeah,
skin, and
yeah,
that must, wow.
yeah, and just things like the heat, and the flies, and I was up in Arnhem Land for a little while, and just all spending time in the outback is just it's just a glorious thing, and I think that really comes through in the story.
We're going to switch tracks a little bit and be a little bit more prosaic and talk about your writing process. So I imagine we've got three very different processes happening here, but authors and would-be writers always want to know these kind of things. Are you a morning or evening writer? Do you sit down and write for hours at a time to a word count, or do you just let it pour out? I suspect Paul's going to tell us it just, it's there, it just pours out when it is. Duncan, morning or evening writer?
Morning and
Yeah.
afternoon. I never write at night.
Never write at night. Yeah.
And
Okay.
very early on, somebody said, I think I read an author who is also a doctor. I write in the cracks in between time, or some such thing that I thought was garbage. And the only way to write for me is to be disciplined, and I like to have a routine. I take a holiday to write. I don't try to. I haven't always done it this way. Like I have written in between seeing patients on slow days when I was a doctor, but by and large, I like to have blocks of time, at least a morning, but the whole day. But it usually involves a routine where I like to feel good, like having done exercise and meditation, and then sat down with coffee, and then I write, and I don't have a word count. I write, and if nothing comes, I just force myself to write, because ultimately you will get into the flow and a bit of momentum develops. And when looking at a scene, you can picture the scene in your mind, and as Paul has described, you write that down. One of the most exciting aspects of writing for me, and what I like doing, is the human condition and how people behave. And it is amazing how, when you are writing from a character doing stuff or thinking stuff, that character takes you places that you never actually thought was going to occur. And you can have as many plots as you want, and they can go out the door as you're writing, because if you inhabit the character in this state of mind, and I'm sure Paul and Anne know what I'm talking about, that when you get into that state, it is so enjoyable, and time does fly. Then it might go. I mean, people talk about a flow state.
Yes.
But it's a bit like that, and that is so enjoyable, and you don't want to stop, and you keep on going, and then it might peter out, and then you might have something to eat. But every little bit of research or reading of authors who have described what they do and what their process is, and strangely enough, one of the best ones I've read is Stephen King. I'm not into horror.
But he writes well about writing.
About the craft of writing.
Yes.
Is interesting, but a lot of the writers are disciplined and have a routine. Some are morning only, some treat it like a work day,
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, that's what I do.
Yeah. Quiet or music or whatever's happening.
I don't quiet.
Right.
When I'm working at my work, I have music.
Yeah.
I always have music on, but I don't when I'm writing.
Mm. It's interesting, isn't it? We just
Yeah.
need set of circumstances. All right, Paul, what about you? Tell us.
No
Morning,
word
afternoon, coffee, wine. What's the go?
no word count, no
No.
discipline.
No.
Glass of wine.
Yes.
Yep.
But no planning. I don't plan anything. And it just comes. I never have writer's block or anything. It just flows. I think after 4 books, I think I've had writer's block once in my life. And I mean, and the good thing I suppose about not planning is the fact that I really like twists and turns.
Mm-hmm.
And I like the endings to be totally different to what people think they're going to be. So because I don't plan anything, I can actually sort of like go backwards to sort of like the beginning of the novel and plant something that may have a lasting effect or a twist and a turn later on in the novel.
Yeah.
And it just sort of like comes. As I say, it's like a movie just taking place in front of my eyes.
Yeah. So morning, evening, when is the best time for you to tap into that?
Usually morning.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Very
Usually
good.
morning. And that's the best time. First 2 or 3 hours in the morning.
Yeah, I find that as well. Quiet time. Do you need quiet? Can you write in a cafe? Do you like music? What's the story there?
No, it's good. Quiet and basically just head in the computer.
Yep. Just head down.
Yeah.
Away you go.
Yeah.
Lovely. All right, Anne, we've had
Anne.
both ends of the spectrum here.
Where do you
What about
fall?
yourself? Yes.
Yes, well, I have to say my process is a little different depending on the book I'm doing, because the first book, The Shipwife, was based on a real person. So I had to be true to a lot of what was there. And in that way, it was rather different from Flight, the current novel, where the characters just came to me and they were my characters and they took over my head in the way that Duncan mentioned, and I would go for walks and I would suddenly see, as Paul was saying, most horrendous scenes involving Peter, especially the man. And so much of the story would kind of just bubble up while I was doing something else, like walking or whatever, watching a film even sometimes. Doesn't say a lot for the film. But also I'm a great well, Patrick White used to go to I'm not like him, of course, obviously, but he used to go to opera and his literary brain and imagination would be moving along. Anyway, but yeah, so I'm certainly a night person and I'm certainly one who re-edits. So although in the first draft stage and again later, often when I think of when a new scene comes to me or the character sort of reveals something else, I'll write just in a rush, but I always come back and I'm a great redrafter. I don't really, well, certainly in the Flight, which was all from my imagination, I didn't have a plan exactly. In fact, whether the characters would remain as a couple was a really big thing that I didn't know. I didn't know for a long time. And people would say to me, "Oh, you're writing this story about an American and an Australian. Do they end up together?" And I would say, "Well," and friends would say, "Oh, you're a very optimistic person, and I'm sure you'll have them ending up together." And then other people would say, well, of course, the novels these days don't tell you what happens. So, are you going to leave us just, on a limb wondering? So, it was so interesting rewriting and rewriting, especially towards the ending there. But I'm a person who adores music, but I don't have it on much when I'm writing. And I could write in cafes. I can write anywhere. I write on holidays sometimes in funny little rooms, either with computers or iPads or or phones or pen and paper, whatever. But certainly, I just think the redrafting and the working with other people, I get other people to read it. I'm in a writers group. I've had mentors, I really want to know fairly early in the piece what people think of what I'm doing.
Yeah. Fantastic. 3 very different writing styles.
Yes. So very quickly, sci-fi question for you all. Which historical period would you choose to go back to if you could go for a visit? Anne?
Oh, this is really hard. I was thinking of it this afternoon, and I was torn between what I used to say when I was 20, which was I want to go back to Jane Austen's era.
Oh,
And be
yes.
Of course, not be one of the servants.
Yeah.
Or, of course, later, I'm very, very fascinated with the 1930s in America or England or Europe, Paris or Melbourne, Sydney. So it's those 2 eras, I think, and for slightly different reasons. Particularly, I guess, the films and the music and the changes that were happening in the 1930s.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Paul?
1590 Yorkshire.
Oh,
Wow. Okay. Explain.
Because how my first novel, Skullduggery, came about was about a year before then. I spent about 6 months developing family history,
Wow.
mostly for my kids. And I wrote a 400-page family history and I only got five printed just to give to my kids and my family. And about a year later, I thought, my great-grandfather times 10 lived on the moors of Yorkshire in 1590. He was a copy holder, just a peasant. And that's why I like writing about ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. That's sort of seems to be a common theme through my novels. I actually researched and found his name on a manor court roll. And that was sort of like the spark. And what I wanted to do is actually find out, what his life would have been like with his children and that. And of course, all my ancestors from 1590 to the mid 1800s all came from a place called Howarth, which, Anne, you'd probably know because the Bronte sisters grew up there. And the first ancestor to move away from Howarth was my great-grandfather, who was a carpenter, and he moved to Keighley to build sort of like houses for the mill workers. But yeah, I'd like to go back to 1590 Howarth. I've been there many, many times to Withens and Top Withens and all that type of thing. But yeah, go back in time and just pop in and see great-granddaddy times 10.
Oh, I love that. Duncan?
It's a very difficult question. I love history, and there's so many eras. You could go back to ancient Greece and Rome. Any time when anything about the development or insight into thinking, philosophy and thinking, and then with the advance of science is interesting. But I think what I would like is, and apart from going back to when I was born with everything I know now and starting again, it would be, I think, to go back to the period where my parents were children, to understand what they went through and how that shaped them, because that shapes me. And yes, I could go back further, but in particular, my father was born in 1918 in Sydney, and he suffered polio and was in a wheelchair, and his father was kicked out of the house when he was young and had to forego a career to provide for the family when he was 15, and he became an Australian swimming champion from training from polio. But he never had the opportunities other than working for a company for 40 years because there was no other source of money. And, there's various aspects of that. And my mother was born in 1932. And I'm fascinated with what they went through for the reasons that I said. It's nothing exciting and nothing in my family history that's outstanding, and that's not true. But let's assume that is true. There is nothing, it's bog standard history like everyone else, particularly if they came from England or Scotland or wherever. But I would like to know more about their upbringing because it's so important. Childhood development and how it affects other people along the way, which we continue to pass on bits of with our other generation. I don't want to have this going to a morbid overtones, but I think that that's what I probably would do because I don't know where I would want to go. And certainly what Paul said, that sounds pretty interesting to me. Might be in a different part of England and Scotland, but it sounds pretty interesting to me.
Yeah, fantastic.
Love it.
All right.
Yeah.
We are absolutely out of time, but I'm going to ask you to be really briefly advice for new writers. Given your experience, you all have, published works now. What advice would you give a new writer, somebody who really should have written when they were left university, but went away and had 2 careers and now has come back and has to write again? What advice would you give them? Anne, let's start with you.
Well, I think the advice is believe in yourself and keep on writing, and also be honest with yourself and look at your writing carefully. Does it need more work? What do you need to learn? And maybe go and do writing courses. You can do terrific short ones these days as well as long ones. Writing groups, the writers' associations in each state are fabulous. I think all those things, I certainly found them very helpful. And I think going into competitions or other kinds of ways that you can get your writing, get some feedback on your writing, I think that's really important. And also, if you don't succeed for a while, take seriously the criticisms that people give you and maybe move out and write a new book. Sometimes working on the one, if it's not going to work, if you're a person who has many ideas, you can move on. If you have something that you're absolutely passionate about and it's not getting accepted, well, again, I think getting a mentor, maybe from one of the writing centres, is going to give you some understanding of where the book stands and how to get it to a publishable standard. But, I encourage everyone because it is just such a wonderful thing to do. And I didn't really get time or the economic circumstances to write till a fairly late stage, write seriously in my life. So, you can do it at any age.
Yeah. Excellent advice.
Great advice.
Yeah. Paul.
Most important thing is to have a sense of humor, not take yourself too seriously. Allow yourself to grow. Know that it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. I know my first novel, Skullduggery, was actually republished. There's a second edition, and the first novel was absolutely terrible. I'll be the first one to admit it. And so I went back and rewrote it, and I learned a lot from rewriting it. And as an author, you learn so much from sort of like when you start to, after 3 or 4 novels, just about sort of like character arcs and using say things like memory as a way to sort of like describe certain things that have happened in the story. But yeah, just enjoy it. don't take yourself too seriously, and do it.
Yeah.
Love it.
Like it.
Love it.
Duncan, the final word.
I didn't endorse what Anne and Paul have said. I would add, apart from just doing it and not being arrogant, be patient, persevere. Iris Murdoch, I think, wrote 3 duds before she got published with Under the Net. And I think that story is not uncommon. Listen, learn the craft, get as many voices telling you honest opinions and listen. But don't try to write something that you think's going to be a hit. Don't write something that you're interested in. You have to have a reader in mind. But if you don't actually write something that you want to write, then it's just an exercise in trying to have commercial success, which may or may not occur. And so you have to believe in what you're doing and enjoy what you're doing, but you have to be open and honest. And I'm just repeating what Paul and have said, with which I agree, and I'd imagine many authors would say the same thing if they're sincere about their art and what they do.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And I believe you can always tell somebody who's written it from the heart as opposed to someone who's written to target audience. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.
So Anne Vines, Paul Rushworth-Brown and Duncan Graham, thank you very much for your time and for all your stories and your great advice. And Laurie Bell, thank you for keeping us on track and sharing some of the questions. We could chat for another hour, but we won't, because that's the end. Remind our listeners to read
more Aussie
books. Yeah,
Yep.
fantastic. Thanks,
for now,
everybody.
everyone.
Bye for now.
Let's meet again, where magic happens.